So hi, Christina. It's great to have this conversation with you. I'm excited. And so I guess that people outside, especially of the synthetic biology sphere, will want to know what does it mean to be a creative director at Ginkgo? And I would like to ask this question, as in, how do you tell your children about your role?
So I love that question. Well, because first of all, my kids are very young. They're in kindergarten and second grade. So usually like they're just like completely not interested in like the grown-up world at all, like what we do. They're like, oh yeah, you like talk on the phone a lot. I don't know what you do for or like but when they when there's a story about a scientist like in a book that they're reading or on TV, I'm like, did you know that I'm a scientist? And so then they know that they know there's like something about science, and then there's like something about germs. And I sort of like anytime it comes up, like there's a show called Storybots on Netflix that's great, and they have a whole episode on DNA, and I was like, do you know that I do stuff with DNA? And they're like, okay. So I don't know if that, like, yeah, explaining it like I explained to my kids, probably not the best at this point. But I can explain it sort of more generally what I do, which is it's I've used this term like creative to sort of to like carve out a space where kind of creativity and storytelling and imagination like can and should be part of the way that we do biotechnology. But then in practice, that looks like the kind of functions that exist in a company, like marketing, communications, policy, brand, design. Like those are the roles that sort of exist on my team. And the whole, what brings them together is this sort of notion of like being in between the technology and other audiences that we have, whether those are our customers, our investors, the media, sort of the outside world, right? Like how are we translating across those things? How are we sort of interpreting and understanding the problems that we want to solve, whether they're our customers' problems out in the world? How do we sort of like do that sort of back and forth exchange of and how do we sort of do that in a way that is creative and sort of about synthesis and bringing things together and making things happen. So yeah, my team does marketing, we do brand, we do policy, we do communications, we do PR. But we use a lot of these tools, from design, from imagination, from storytelling, to bridge this gap that kind of that inevitably exists between sort of the inside and the outside of the company and the technology.
Sure. And I was reading your one of your interviews, and you mentioned like perhaps the importance of having this creative aspect and portion of the company is that otherwise other people would tell that story. And usually, let me know if I'm wrong, but the like trend I've seen in how the media represents biotech companies, aside from, I guess, creating solutions to problems and so on, sometimes biotech is seen more as this Jurassic Park, I guess, with a negative connotation and so on. It's like you want to really tell, the story of how you think about it and what your mission is. So could you tell us a little bit more about the importance of science communication in that sense?
Sure. I mean, and I'll also tell maybe a story a little bit more about Ginkgo. So, right, like I
Sure.
told you about what my team does, and I didn't say what Ginkgo does, right? So, Ginkgo is a synthetic biology company. Our mission is to make biology easier to engineer. Um, uh, Absolutely, like the point of having that mission is so that we make things better, right? Like and better can mean a lot of different things, and so we have to sort of really interrogate that. Like, what does it look like to be better? How do we apply this in a positive way? What are the ways that we're going to like save the world? How do we make the sort of marvelous, wonderful, like amazing parts of Jurassic Park like wow, like dinosaurs, like that's cool, like but also like respect to the biology, respect like evolution, respect what we can do with it and like what it should be doing, to sort of protect against the bad parts of Jurassic Park. So in fact, for us, Jurassic Park is super important as this kind of cultural moment and a cultural sort of story that helps us kind of show both sides, right? Like that biology can do incredible things, like just completely amazing, so wonderful. But there's also this kind of risk involved. Life finds a way, and the attempts to sort of completely try to control that and corral that, like inevitably are going to be limited. And so like what should we, how could we do this? How might we explore biology and be
Yeah.
part of it? Anyway, so that's what Ginkgo wants to do. And therefore, like, of course, that story we tell and the way that we bring people together to imagine what the good version is going to be, right? Like when we say we want to make the world better, this is something I learned from Daisy Ginsburg, right? Like you say, better for who, right? Like what does better mean? Like who's at the table to be part of that? Like how do we do that work, right? And so if you don't do it on purpose, exactly, like it's gonna be it's not going to necessarily go in that positive direction. It won't happen inevitably. It won't inevitably be positive. It has to be something that we sort of do intentionally together. And so that's your brand. That's what you're building. Like that's the community that's making it possible. That's the team. That's the culture. And all of those things are super important. They're necessary to make a new technology and to make a new technology that's going to have a positive impact.
And so I remember that in another one of our conversations, you were also talking about how this, for example, the Grow magazine was inspired by another, like, I guess, early, digital hardware tech company. Was it Intel?
Oh, so there was like a couple inspirations. It was IBM.
IBM.
So
Okay.
IBM. So like, well, there's a sort of like immediate inspiration, which is a group called The Engine, which is a small like early stage VC firm, kind of like connected to MIT here in Cambridge. They have really great storytelling about their sort of community, their portfolio, like what hard tech innovation really looks like. And they had a magazine called Tough Tech that their team built, and it was like we saw it and we're like, oh my God, this is so cool! Like, what an amazing way to be able to like kind of articulate and bring together that kind of a vision and sort of like create this artifact that can sort of tell that story. And so that was like an immediate like, oh wow, we could do that, like that would be super interesting. Like, so The Engine is great, like love them, super inspirational. And then actually like what we learned after we started working on building this magazine, we were going to call it Grow. Which is kind of a word. Again, we had kind of borrowed grow as this kind of like emblem kind of word already for Ginkgo, the way that IBM had think. So IBM had think as this kind of word that they kind of put it everywhere, all over their offices, and it was really this kind of like motto that drove their culture. Like they think, they make machines that think. They like that was a real driver of what they were trying to do. And in fact, we learned later they also had a magazine called Think that they started in the 1930s to really kind of like articulate again that for them it was this vision of like, what is a computer in the first place? Like what does data processing mean or look like? What could you do with a computer? How is it going to change society? And so that magazine ran for 40 years. During this kind of like huge growth in IBM and in computing as an industry, and not just an industry, but as a technology, as something that like changed the way we do things in all of these different ways. And so they had sort of alongside again the people like building and selling the technology, they also were always very deliberately thinking about like, what is it going to be, what will it do, how will it transform things, like and how does that sort of thinking about what might be possible like take shape and shape. And so that was happening in this magazine too. So that became this kind of sort of second inspiration as we continue to build Grow.
I love that. It is indeed very inspirational. So when you mention who are we building these technologies for? I wonder, so I was reading this article recently and it talked about like how more mainstream something like Chat GPT is nowadays
Yeah.
than things like, I don't know, synthetic biology generally, or,
Yeah.
dye made with bacteria, no,
Uh-huh.
to mention an example. And so I wonder, in that sense, who is Grow, for example, or Ginkgo, the creative team, currently targeting more of the, companies and your customers, of course, or how are you thinking about bringing synthetic biology into the mouths of everyone else outside the symbio space?
I'd say probably like we are often like thinking about like a much broader audience, but even like there is no like one like mainstream or like one public, right? Like
Yeah.
there's lots and lots of different kinds of people
Mhm.
and lots of different kinds of ways that they sort of like engage with this kind of stuff. And so I think we are very conscious of that and sort of thinking about it. But often like but we recognize the need to sort of like be often talking to sort of a much narrower set of people, kind of like sort of already part of our community. We want to grow that community directly with people who are sort of already like building
Sure.
with these kinds of technologies or thinking about it. But then like, but you have to sort of connect it to a bigger story and like a more sort of mainstream message and the mainstream like possibilities, right? So like even
Mhm.
for those people in our community, like they have customers, like they have people that they want to be engaging with this technology. Like that's part of the ecosystem too. So I think you have to sort of be doing it at different levels at the same time. In terms of like the mainstreaming of Chat GPT, like that's super interesting, right? Like I actually remember like this is something I think about frequently because people are like, oh, like nobody understands like synthetic biology. Like we have to do all this work to kind of like, whatever. Like nobody
Mhm.
understands molecular biology. It's like too confusing. And like, if you talk about it, it's like too dense. It's too, like that's the sort of complaint. And then I'm always kind of think about it like I don't know what AGI like really
Right.
means. Like I'm not a computer scientist. Like, I mean, I can read the news articles about it. I can like just type the prompts. I can play around with it. Like I know why it's important, but like, do I really understand it? Like, no. Like do I understand anything at all about blockchain and like everything people were talking about 5 years? Like, no way, no way. And like most
Right.
people too, who were like writing those articles about like blockchain is going to have this next big thing. I think they also didn't understand it. Certainly not to the level that like, yeah,
Mhm.
those of us, yeah, like synthetic biology, right? Like, and so I think there's also sort of a sense of like, how does it become something that can be like vernacular too? Like, what is that sort of transition point? Like, what is it that makes those things sort of like cross over into the mainstream? So like I would argue like CRISPR as a concept like really did like have a sort of mainstream like crossover, like where
Mhm.
people are like literally like talking about CRISPR. Like my mom was like, you do CRISPR? Do you do CRISPR?
Yeah.
And so that was really interesting, right? Like that word, that notion, like really helped people connect to it somehow. Even again, like people don't really understand how it works. Like they're not actually going to be pipetting. Like that's fine,
Sure.
right? Like, but they're kind of get the concept. And I think the same sort of like we saw maybe that the next one has been like mRNA, right? Like okay, mRNA vaccines. Like I get it, I understand. Like so, I
Mhm.
think that's it is mainstream, is what I'm saying. Maybe like at that level, as much as sort of Chat GPT is, right? Like as like, oh, there's this kind of like, yeah, like that kind of token word
Mhm.
brand, right? It's a
Right.
brand about that sort of connects to a concept that like underneath has so much complexity, that like there's experts who like the experts don't really understand. The experts are trying to figure it out. Like that's the point of the experts at this point for those new kinds of technologies. Like, what might it be? What could it look like? What are the tools that we need to sort of keep approaching and get better? So that's true in AI. It's true in synthetic biology. It's true where they intersect with each other. And so I think the concepts, many of the concepts in synthetic biology are truly mainstream, right? Like people know Jurassic Park. they know they know about DNA. They know about mRNA. Like mRNA vaccines, that's synthetic biology. They know about CRISPR. they know about GMOs, like they're engaging with it, they're asking questions, they're saying
Mhm.
like, I want this, I don't want this, I think this, I that, like, right, like we're
Right.
having that conversation in the mainstream. And so the question becomes like, how do we participate in that, and how do we yeah, how do we participate in that, how do we sort of build that conversation, how do we turn that into the sort of next the next developments, the next iteration, the next kind of generation of this stuff.
Right. Yeah, I guess that's an answer that I didn't expect. Like perhaps synthetic biology is already mainstream, but in a way that we don't notice it as much. I was thinking, well,
Yeah.
maybe, something like ChatGPT scales faster than something like lab-grown meat, right? It's that's going to take more time for people to actually be in direct touch with.
But again, like how many billions of people got vaccinated within a
Sure.
period of
Yeah.
1 year, right? Like that was incredible. And so
Yeah.
like and so many people again like working together to make that possible all over the world, like there's it can scale and it does,
Yeah.
like when it's right, and when sort of everything is aligned, and so and that has taken, right, like for that to be possible, like we are tremendously lucky that COVID did happen when it did, rather than like 10, 20 years earlier, right? Like that wouldn't have been possible 20 years ago. Like
Right.
there has been this kind of infrastructure that's been built and changed, and those people thinking about the tools, what should be possible, what might synthetic biology look like, and that sort of has set the stage for all of these things to be possible. And so yeah, I would say, yeah, I think it's happening. It has happened, like it will continue to happen. And I think we sort of, maybe that's a sort of other piece of it here, like,
Hmm.
or when we think about culture or our community or others, I think biologists, and sort of scientists, like there is a sort of like scientist culture mentality, sort of like approach. I sort of associate very much with scientists and sort of my upbringing as a scientist, like as well as Boston, kind of
Hmm.
like in contrast with San Francisco, sort of
Right.
like a Silicon Valley culture where
Hmm.
we like you can like literally have saved the world and like be literally curing cancer and literally doing all of these things, and everyone's like, oh, it doesn't work, like it's not gonna like we see all the sort of like failings, right, or like
Hmm.
it's not perfect yet, right. And so I think we, rather than sort of see it as like what isn't yet right, like, oh, I only see the negatives, right, do you know what I'm saying, like I'm like phrasing this wrong, but like I think that there's a kind of like exuberance and optimism and ambition, which can definitely like cross over into like toxic territory. Don't get me
Hmm.
wrong. Like from the sort of Silicon Valley people, like the blockchain's gonna change everything, everything's gonna be
Yeah.
different, everything's
The
amazing.
hype,
Like
the
and we
overhype.
like, yeah, which drives some of that sort of innovation too. Like
Hmm.
but I think like the sort of scientific, uh like the kind of like rigorous skepticism, like it's what makes science so good.
Sure.
It's again like it's a good thing that scientists like do think that way, but I think it also like it makes us so pessimistic, we like don't see the successes when they are right in front of us,
Hmm.
and sort of like we sort of see it all as a failure rather than a sort of like path of like how these things will happen and how they will change and how these things will evolve and like what we'll learn from and what happens next. And right, like is chat gpt like AI, like AGI, like not yet.
Hmm.
Like are people talking about it, like and thinking about it and
They
building on
are,
top of it
yeah.
and imagining what it should be and like thinking, like hashing out all of the stuff that it could, how it could look like, absolutely. And that's super interesting, right? So what I think that's happening too for synthetic biology. So like, yeah, like let's like recognize that and do it on purpose. That's what
I
I
love
think.
that. Yeah, yeah. Okay, and so I guess something that I didn't have the chance to ask you previously is how did you arrive at Ginkgo? What was the journey to that, and what was something that perhaps, made you coming from this, I guess, very scientific mindset and doing
Yeah.
your PhD in academia and so on, what made it interesting to you to be in a more of a creative role? I guess you've mentioned some of these aspects already, telling these stories
Yeah.
and so on, but tell me a little bit more about the journey.
Right. So I did a PhD because I wanted to be one of these like rigorous, hard-nosed, skeptical scientists. And I only wanted to do like, I only wanted to do like molecules and biochemistry. I wanted to be a chemist. And I was like I just loved it, right? Like every bit about it. And I was so obsessed. And so I was, started my PhD thinking I was going to become like really do like organic chemistry, like pharmacology, like, chemical biology. And I like happened to meet Pam Silver during the orientation week at Harvard. And like, she like blew me away. Like I had never met someone like her. Like and I had never too, like as a student at that time, like had never been able to sort of interact with professors like in a way that sort of was more at a level of like not quite peer, but more peer than when you're an undergrad, right? Like we're like out to dinner together at the like orientation, because that's the kind of relationship that they want you to be building, like as a graduate student, is like you're part of the scientific community. Like this is a community there. The professors aren't teaching you, they're your colleagues, kind of, right? It's sort of like the vibe, right? And so like, and that was like, first of all, like that was exciting to me. I was like, oh, I'm a scientist. It was exciting. And then she had this like just like totally like just incredible charisma, first of all. And like she was like she was sort of asking these questions that were very different again than sort of like the scientific sort of mentality that I had sort of been trained in at that time, right? Because it wasn't like, oh, like how does this work? It's like, how could it work for us or with us, right? So she was saying like, oh yeah, my team is we're gonna solve climate change. Like we're gonna make biofuels. Like we're doing, and I had never heard of this before at that time. And like this idea that she was like, what do you think biology should do? What do you want to do with it? Like we're doing synthetic biology. And I was like, what is that? Right? Like she's like, we're making stuff happen. Like, what do you think it should be? And that was a question like no one had ever asked me before. Everything else, like all the other kind of religions, like, oh, like, well, you got to figure out what this like phosphorylation cascade blah 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 whatever looks like. Or like I studied this part of this thing inside of cell bio, which maybe will cure cancer someday. Was sort of like the what most people were sort of like it felt like. And then she was like, no, big, like what is it, what could it
big
be?
picture.
Big picture. And she also, the other thing that she did, which was again like so surprising to me and so like again like eye-opening, life-changing. It was exactly around the time when the president of Harvard, Larry Summers, had said that women are bad at science, like maybe biologically. Do you remember this? Like it was like, oh yeah, like maybe we should just look objectively at the facts and see like the fact that women are not doing, like not achieving more in science and technology just has to do with their like innate ability. And so, and like, and Pam was there, like laughing her head off, like, and just be like, can you believe this idiot? And like saying not even less nice language. And I like I don't know, that felt like so, to be able to like laugh at that and like and sort of be like and just like so outright like reject that, like I don't know, I appreciated it. I needed that. And I also sort of like so that moment, right, like opened up this like two branches for me. One of like, what could biology be? Like I was like, I want to be a synthetic biologist. I want to ask that question. Like I want to do that kind of creating with biology. That feels very exciting. I want to work with Pam to do that. So like that that sort of was the first sort of thing. It was like my path to where I came to. And then the other stuff, like kind of like recognizing the like ridiculousness and like cruelty like of people using science, like this thing that I loved, and this kind of like notion of like that rigor and that objectivity and weaponizing it against a group of people, like and sort of recognizing like how ashamed we should be as scientists for that, like rather than like, rather than saying like, yes, that is true, like the facts of the matter are that like women are dumb. Like,
Mhm.
obviously it just like can't be true. It's not
Sure.
true. And so like, how have we like let people like him still get away with it? Like that was like,
Mhm.
so many years, right? Like that science has been this like tool of oppression rather than like a tool for like bringing everybody up, right? Like, and so what would science look like if we could like Pam did, just like reject it outright? Like, that's not what science is. That's not
Mhm.
what science is going to look like. We're going to do it differently. And so those are two moments. Okay, one moment that became two sort of threads. Okay, so I joined Pam's lab. I'm trying to do climate related things. I'm making biofuels. Like, again, like as a trained as a scientist, like in this sort of like world of science, like again, like where sort of our value is measured in kind of the experimental output and results. And everyone was telling me to kind of like focus more on the details of the science, and like, okay, you gotta like figure out this little pathway and this little part of this little enzyme. And I was like,
Mhm.
like, wait, is this gonna solve energy?
Yeah.
What will it actually take to
Thinking
solve
about,
this
yeah, more
problem?
the applicable part of it. And so
Yeah,
you mentioned that, this very like scientific mindset of being sometimes very
yeah,
focused on like this very niche and specific thing. And I wonder what, now working at the Ginkgo creative team, I wonder
yeah.
what are some skills or mindsets that you see scientists with, the like the character you've just described could improve or could acquire to further, have like this bigger vision of the impact that their science is doing.
So like, I that's like, to me, like that's why like Ginkgo especially, and like maybe like, and more generally kind of like a startup or kind of company was interesting to me, or became interesting to me, right? Like I think I recognized there's something wrong with like the way we approach these problems, right? Like capitalism is why we can't solve climate change. Like we there's all these like politics, there's like how things are done in the real world, and how like people communicate, how people exchange, like the visions, and like the politics of these ideas, and like who gets money, how it flows, like how like that is all shaped. Like that's what ultimately sort of like has a lot to do with how these technologies sort of manifest, and how they're shaped. And so like, in as an academic, you can like talk about that. Like at a startup, like you live it, because it's like, what's going to work to go to the next stage. Like, how are we going to sort of like build the all of the things that it takes to kind of make this technology come to be. And how do all of those things come together? And so I think the other thing about sort of a company like versus a sort of academic like world for me was like, the company, it is like really a team effort. Like it's such a collective exercise, and like all of those things matter together. Like nothing I'm doing matters without the people who are building the technology, like who are getting into those small details. But we have to be able to sort of do it together. And in the context of a company, and a company like Ginkgo, like we can and we do, right? So I think there's this kind of I think there has to be kind of like an exchange, an ecosystem of like a shared sort of like common sort of goal that we have to do, and sort of like recognize that the way that we all sort of add and contribute to that is what matters. And so yeah, for sort of like individual scientists, like in terms of that mindset, like I think just to me the most important thing has been that sort of like, like step out of it for a moment, and sort of like look kind of from a different perspective, right? So like, it is very easy to kind of fall into that same trap as Larry Summers, and people still do it. I see it all the time all the time. And so like, I was like, oh yeah, like it's just is this way, like that's just objective, whatever. To sort of, again, like treat it like a scientist, like be skeptical, like dig a little bit deeper, like, well, why? Like, where did that come from? Like, why is that? Like, I actually, like, why did that happen? Like, what are the sort of like other factors? Like, like the, maybe to like, okay, well, one more thought, like, so like, I think people talk about a lot about this notion of like things being socially constructed. So like gender and race and are socially constructed. And scientists often like take that to mean like that people who say that think it's fake or something, like that there's like, it's fake. And it's not that it's fake, like it's very real, like these things are very real. Like a house is constructed, but it is real, but it is made, right? And so to kind of think about those, like the real world, like actual experiences of those things, like are determined and shaped by our social interactions. And those are very, very real. And so just like recognize that those two are real and can be thought about like critically and like yeah, just like critically and rigorously and skeptically, and sort of understand that like the social reality is part of what makes science. And so just like don't be fooled, don't be tricked into thinking that science is like just is just facts, because then you become a tool for the people who want to oppress others. And so if you want to oppress others, like that sucks, but like recognize that that's what you're doing. So maybe that's the sort of, I don't know, maybe that's too complicated or too many layers right now, too messy.
Yeah, too many layers, but I like that. I guess something you mentioned was that not because something is just a story doesn't mean that, it doesn't impact the real world in a sense, and, every layer of reality. So
right. Like politics is real, like it's real. It's really how these things happen, right? Like it's our shared, like our values and what we want the future to look like. Those are real things, and they shape the way that things really happen. And so like we can pretend that they don't exist, or we can like write it off or say it's like not the real thing somehow. But it is the real thing. It is the thing, right? So anyway, I didn't say that part, but I guess like for me, that was that sort of realization that like if I wanted to make biology easier to engineer, if I wanted these technologies to be real, like the technology is really hard, but like this stuff is also like extremely hard, and like we don't pay enough attention to it as scientists. Like we don't bring like our perspective, our rigor, and we can't, like we don't bridge between, again, like the technology, the molecular facts, like and the social facts. And I knew that was going to be necessary to make this technology real. And so that's where I wanted to explore. And to explore that space, like I needed to be like a little bit weird and a little bit on the outside, and like bring in a lot of different kinds of like skills that I didn't have yet as a scientist. And so like I was finding those with social scientists and with artists and designers. And so like that's why I practice it the way that I do, is sort of an accident of all of these things. So everything is like right place, right time, like an accident of like meeting people and building it. But that's why I make it go, how I make it go, and the approach that I take is because like I have the same mission. I want biology. I want us to work with technology that is biological rather than petroleum based. I want us to like rethink how we manufacture everything, and I want to do all of that. And I know that to do it, we have to be engaging with people to make it happen.
To define what you want biology to be and what everyone else wants it to be as well. I like that. So I also read that one of the questions you ask yourself as a creative director is what needs to be true basically for Ginkgo, for example, to fulfill its mission, and as you say, not only in the molecular world but also in the social one. And so I wonder, what are some of the answers or the hypotheses you have on this? What's something that you are somehow trying to influence in I guess in a positive way, of course, to, bring us to this larger vision of an abundant future with synthetic biology?
Um, this is a great question. There's, again, so many like possible
Layers,
like
yeah.
layers and like directions that you could take it, right? So like in many ways, like ginkgo, right? Like again, with a mission to make biology easier to engineer, like it's what we're all trying to build, right? Like what needs to be true, like in order for biology to be easier. Like I think we believe that what needs to be true is that there's a shared common platform where we can like learn and keep improving and keep scaling like what it is possible to do to access with biology, and that through that kind of like shared platform and kind of generalized set of tools, we'll be able to do more and more better synthetic biology, basically. So like the kind of core heart of Ginkgo, the technology platform, is itself like that the first answer to that question of what needs to be true. So there's like the technology platform that has this kind of feedback loop that we hope will keep getting, and we see keeps getting better the more experiments we do, and that soon more and more people will be able to access to use to do the kinds of technology development that we need for synthetic biology. There's like the layer of it that's also the business model. So like if you build a generalized set of tools for cell engineering, like how do you like keep growing that, right? Like what do you sell to sort of enable that to keep being true, to build it so that it can maintain, like keep being horizontal, keep being sort of generalized for everybody. So how we work with our customers is like this sort of next layer. And then there's like then there's so many other things, right? Like I think across the ecosystem, right? Like how and what are people investing in, right? Like what are the applications that are sort of ready, like near term, medium term, long term? How do we imagine those? How are there new startups? Like how are they getting sort of funded, and like how are they like staffing? Like where's the workforce? Like how are we educating people to become synthetic biologists? Like all of those questions start to become like what needs to be true to make biology easier to engineer. And then there's the question of, okay, within those applications, like we're talking about like now where technologies also sort of like meet problems out in the world to solve, like, and people who will like buy or not buy the solutions being offered, right? So how do you design, like, there's amazing work happening in fashion and materials, imagining like, rethinking entire supply chains and the ways that people might sort of work, buy and engage with like their everyday products in cosmetics, in fashion, in like food, agriculture, how we grow our food, like all of those things now you can start to like ask questions of how do we rethink all of those things. All of those things be true. And then people have to be able to like talk about GMOs.
Tell me about
right?
the GMO sticker.
Yeah. So like, right. So we're saying, for 20 years, synthetic biologists are saying like, we're going to make GMO everything. And there's this elephant in the room, like this, and a real fear when you talk to the synthetic biologist of like, oh, but people don't like GMOs. like, are they gonna like, how, like, there's a sort of like, when people bring it up, like I think it comes in a few flavors. Like one is this kind of like exasperation, like don't people know it's going to be better, like they're dumb. I need to teach them about science so they'll like, so we can just get on with it. Is a sort of like the first kind of layer. Then there's a sort of like, oh, like maybe we need to like, if you kind of get beyond the like people are dumb and bad and just like the exasperated part, like there's the next layer is like, oh, like maybe we need like a different set of words, like we're gonna call it something else and like make it seem friendlier, like and like then we'll get through. There's a lot of energy that can sort of like get sunk into those kinds of things, like or people are sort of, this kind of notion of like rebranding. So like I have a conversation like at least once a week where somebody's like, you really shouldn't call it synthetic biology, you know?
What are they suggesting instead?
I mean, so there's folks who are calling it precision fermentation. That's super interesting. There's people who are calling it like biodesign. There's people calling it, like there's a lot, they're bioengineered. Like all of these are sort of like interesting words, and I like, again, like I'm interested in it sort of academically. But I think there's also like there's something more like to the heart of the matter that you sort of probably need. So like yes, brand, obviously brand. I think brand is important, and like how we talk about it, how we sort of help people imagine it, how we educate people, like all of that is part of these things. But I think we first have to sort of educate ourselves too about like, where is that like concern coming from? Like, what is the concern around GMO? It's not just the word, obviously. And so then the question becomes like, what are the values that people sort of like that people ascribe to GMOs and reject, right? And how do we sort of get beyond that, right? So people, the GMO as a concept, as a word, has become this like proxy for like a very kind of particular set of like a relationship to nature, to food, to agriculture, that was like very much shaped by the like 1990s like discussion around like GMO corn. And so when people sort of talk about GMOs, they're usually talking about like, oh, I am worried about the like use of chemicals in certain ways. I'm worried about like the risks and impacts, because I have seen over decades like how these kinds of chemicals, like they can spill, they can hurt people, they can harm people. Like I'm concerned about how that like this kind of approach, like, it reshapes like farming communities, like reshapes the economies of different parts of the country. I'm worried about how like, like who is benefiting. And like, those are the kinds of conversations that people like, I think that the people who are, like, when you kind of dig deep, like that's where what often is at the heart of it. And so like, what are those values like that we are now bringing? Like, are we saying like we want to do that, or we want to do something else? Like, what is that something else? Like, what might that be? Like, is that something that we actually like have in common with people, in fact, who are worried about GMOs and those and things? And I think that is what we're starting to see. And so like, I think for what it's worth, like, I think a lot of those folks who are talking about precision fermentation, who are talking about biodesign, who are talking about these, using these other words, like they are addressing that root cause. Like they're trying to solve problems that exist like because of these kinds of other approaches. Like they're trying to replace certain kinds of like harmful like ingredients or processes. They're trying to bring more sort of like living biological processes into the ways that we make food, that we make our cosmetics, we make our ingredients. So like they share more in common with the people who are worried about GMOs than it may appear. because again, that GMO became this kind of like label, this brand. And so therefore like I want GMOs, then like we don't escape that by just calling it something else. We escape it by doing something different, and that is what is happening. And so that's why I made these stickers that say I heart GMO, to sort of ask, like, to be a provocative on purpose, to like help us kind of get over that like instinctive fear of the brand and like of what it or what it represents, and to like dig deeper, to say like, what would it take to make GMOs that people love? And like, in fact, like, and people are doing it. Like, I think that's what's really amazing. Like, I think we've seen now over the past 5-10 years, like stories of products, of ideas, of cosmetics, of things that, like, again, like, we're not using the word, but it doesn't really matter, like, because because people do sort of, like, they'll say, how is it made? Like, oh, well, we genetically engineer
the association,
we make it
there.
Like it will always be there. And like, again, there's certain people you'll never convince, like they don't touch my DNA. Okay, that's fine. Like but but it's more than that, right? Like it's because you're making a product that people want, that people love.
Mhm.
And so that's been, again, that's feels like the thing, that kind of like more holistic
Narrative.
kind of design and
Yeah.
engineering of a
But I mean,
sense.
you mentioned that I wasn't thinking about how that this may help synthetic biology companies themselves, to get
Yeah,
rid of this, I guess, fear, as you say, of the GMO brand. But I wonder
yeah.
if so far there are any, stories with, again, people perhaps who find this sticker provocative to think about it differently. I guess I saw on Twitter once that, people finding ginkgo people with the sticker and asking about
Yeah.
it and so on. Do you have any like anecdotes there?
I have so many. It's great. Like again, like when you can actually have a conversation and you have this sort of like openness, like
Yeah,
we're not starting from like a hostile, like you better understand GMOs are going to
sure.
deal with it. Like it's like, oh, let me tell you about what I do. Like I love,
Mhm.
this is great. Like here's one example. I actually was working on a slide deck on a plane. And so I'm like
Mhm.
typing in my computer and I talk about this story. And so often I sort of like lead into it with a picture of people like a march against Monsanto, like people marching in the street with posters that are like GMO
Yeah.
crossed out, right? And so I had that picture up and I was sort of typing my notes, and the woman sitting next to me on the plane like kind of looked over, she's like, oh, GMOs, yeah, they're bad, huh? And I was like, wow, like
Let me tell you
let me
about.
show you my next slide.
Yeah.
Which is the like me and the like, so it was somebody holding up the I Heart GMO sticker, and I was like, oh well, so what we do is we're actually working to engineer microbes to like replace some of these chemicals. We're making
Yeah.
biologicals for agriculture. We're thinking about like addressing climate change. We're making these kinds of like animal free proteins. And she was like, oh, like that's so cool. Like again, the problems that we were solving like were the same, and so it's
Yeah.
not, we're not trying to solve them through a rejection of GMO, but through a sort of like, again, like a design of a solution that includes this as a technology, but is more sort of holistic around like how it's used and how it impacts people. And so I've had that conversation dozens and dozens of times
Mhm.
with people, and a lot of other people have too. And I think then, like, I'd say, like, again, ginkgo can take this risk on with our brand, is like, I can put out, I can make, I heard GMO stickers, like I can make the t-shirts, like I can go around saying it to my customers. Like I think a lot of our customers, like they worry about that risk, and so like they're necessarily cautious, and I totally respect that. Like and so like I think if we can sort of be part of that story, like, and help kind of like lay the groundwork, like I'd love to do
Mhm.
that. I would love to help like that, and help the whole industry be able to sort of tell new kinds of stories and better stories. And then yeah, so then you can call it whatever you want. And you can show people how it's made and talk
Yeah.
about it, right? Like and help people sort of like really see the values that you are putting into the design of the products that you're making. Like that's what ultimately matters. And so yeah, like I'd say the most hostility I've had to the I Heart GMO sticker is not from GMO critics or like anti-GMO activists, but from that sort of like crowd of like, they should just deal with it scientists. Like
Mm.
there's a particularly cranky Nobel Prize winner who like has yelled at me a couple times. Because he's like, I feel just like GMOs, like, and so like, you shouldn't call it that, you should just like, like it should be unlabeled, like just hide it,
Hmm.
like sneak it in there. And I was like, I don't want to do that. Like I want people to talk about it, I want us to celebrate it, I want us to talk about the values that we want in the design. Like that's the whole point.
Yeah.
Like it's how we will make great things. And so like yeah, I'd say overall, like I think it has been a really sort of positive kind of experiment over the years, as we've sort of shaped it, and I think it continues to spark good conversations. But I think like the world is different now. I made those in 2016. I think there are now more examples of like great designs and GMOs that people do love. And I think there's also like a much greater like realization about like the problems, right? Like again, and a sort of like disentangling of the sort of like particular technology like from the problem. Right, like we're all trying to solve the same like big problems. Like how we approach that like is political, like, and is going to sort of change, and we're going to figure it out over time, but we need to sort of untangle the particular of the technology from like
Mhm.
the what we're trying to actually solve. And so this recognition that like we're all in this together. we're trying to we're trying to fight this, like we're trying to solve this problem. We win together.
Mhm.
I think that's where we need to go.
Yeah, I love that. Finding like the common ground. I mean, in the end, as you say, it's we're all trying to solve the same problem. It's just a matter of the I guess a little details in there of what we call the solutions and how
Yeah.
people perceive them. Finally, I would like to
Yeah.
ask you, so I know that, part of your role, of course, entails design,
Mhm.
and this is just sort of meant to be a funny question. So I once saw on Twitter that Jake, I think Wintermead was, you know, joking about Comic Sans, not being perhaps your most favorite font. So tell me a bit more about that.
I mean, so Comic Sans has become a little bit of a meme
Yeah, yeah.
about as like it's sort of like the bad font. Comic Sans. So it's like it's sort of gone from like, oh my God, isn't it so silly that scientists like choose Comic Sans to put their presentation, like set their presentations to be like fun, and it like looks ugly because it like Comic Sans is like meant for, it has a time and a place.
Mhm.
To sort of like now it's just sort of like morphed. It became this sort of like, again, like emblem of bad design for a long
Mhm.
time. And then like now there's like a sort of like post ironic like meme
Yeah.
of like, now you use Comic Sans like on purpose, again,
Yeah.
like to sort of have a meta narrative about like design and fonts and like how design works.
Mhm,
And so
mhm.
like now I feel like I sort of participated in that whole the arc there. I was like, yes, please, friends, like let's not set our slides in Comic Sans. It does not make you seem fun. It just kind of looks sloppy, doesn't really work here.
Yeah.
Like find a font that works, like to now sort of like appreciating the sort of like meta ironic joke of Comic Sans. So like, I mean, I saw someone was posting in our Slack like someone with a huge back tattoo that says Comic Sans, like in Comic Sans. Like it's become, again, like it's like morphed into this other kind of thing. And so
Yeah.
anyway, I find all of that fascinating. Culture,
Mhm.
design, and like how we sort of talk about these things. It's all very, very interesting to me. So I appreciate Comic Sans for what it is. And I think, yeah, I have also come around. Like I used to spend a lot of time sort of fussing over the details of my slides, and now I just make like white text, or like I'll write one word and be like, that's my slide. And so you know, again, but that's on purpose, right? Like so I'll,
You wanna
again, like
highlight things, yeah.
my last thing is like, the choices that you make, like all the choices, your fonts, your colors, your like all of them, like at all those layers, like they tell a story. And so you can choose them as default, like and sort of accept the default position, or you can choose, and you can make choices as a scientist in how those things are shaped, because together, like all of those things and how we interact with each other, like tells our story of the future and shapes that future that we want to be. So yeah, obviously, like who cares about whether it's one font or another, but like it's all part of how we are sort of like perceived and how we interact and how it is shaped. And so it all matters, and that's how we will make synthetic biology together.
Yay. And thank you so much for sharing these thoughts, Christina. It was
Thank
truly,
you.
truly interesting, and, many layers to many of the questions. These are like, big picture things we got to start thinking about. And so, yeah, I appreciate how, these sorts of conversations also are part of shaping that. So, yeah, I
And
hope
I
you.
appreciate you so much. Thank you so much for all the great questions and for all the work that you do, and the stories that you're telling too.
Thank you. Okay. I will stop.